For 50 years, a man bled, not from an accident, not from any wound a doctor could trace to a cause. 5 marks, in his hands, in his feet, and in his side, the exact wounds of a man crucified 2,000 years ago. They opened on an ordinary morning in 1918, while he was alone in prayer, and they did not close again until the day he died. Doctors came to examine him, serious men, men of science, sent in part to prove him a fraud. They measured the wounds, they studied the blood, they wrote long, careful reports, and what they wrote, again and again, in the cautious language of men who do not like to be made fools of, was that they could not explain what they were looking at. But the wounds were only the beginning. People came to his confessional, first from across Italy, then from across the world, and they spoke afterward, in hushed and shaken voices, of a monk who already knew, who told them the sins they had come to hide, who named the one thing they had buried so deep they had almost convinced themselves it was not there. Some left weeping, some left changed for the rest of their lives, and some he sent away from the door, telling them to come back when they were ready to be honest with God. There were stranger things still, men and women, hundreds of miles away, who swore that he had come to them, that he had stood in their room, spoken to them, knelt beside their dying, at the very hour when he had never once left his friary on a remote mountain in the south of Italy. There were the long nights when his brother friars heard sounds coming from his cell, sounds like a struggle, and found him in the morning, bruised, exhausted, as though he had spent the dark hours fighting something that none of them could see. And for much of his life, the church itself did not know what to make of him. He was investigated, he was doubted. 4 years he was forbidden to celebrate Mass in public, forbidden to hear confessions at all, cut off from the very people who came to him for help, and he obeyed, in silence, in humility, without a single word of complaint. His name was Francesco Forgione, a poor farmer's son from a village most people had never heard of. The world would come to know him as Padre Pio, and the question that followed him for 50 years, the question the doctors could not answer, that the church could not dismiss, that millions of people could not look away from, is the same one that may follow you if you stay with this story to the end. What does it mean when heaven marks a single, ordinary man and refuses to let the world forget him? This is what they saw. He was born into poverty on the 25th of May, 1887, in a small farming village called Pietrelcina, tucked into the hills of southern Italy. His parents were peasant farmers, Grazio Forgione and his wife, Maria Giuseppa. They worked a few small plots of land, raised sheep, and lived the way their families had lived for generations, by the rhythm of the seasons, by hard work, by the church bells that marked the hours of the village. They were not educated people, but they were people of deep, unquestioned faith, the kind of faith that does not argue or analyze, but simply lives in the morning prayers, in the saints' feast days, in the rosary said together in the evening before the lamp was put out. Into this house was born a child they named Francesco, after St. Francis of Assisi. From the beginning, there was something different about him. The other children played the games children play. Francesco played too, but he also withdrew, often, to be alone, to pray. Even as a small boy, he would slip away to the village church and kneel for long stretches before the altar, in a stillness that was unusual for a child his age. Later in his life, when people asked him about it, he spoke, reluctantly, because he did not like to speak of such things, of experiences from his earliest years. He said that from the time he was very young, he had seen and spoken with figures the rest of the world could not see, that heaven, to him, had never felt distant, that it had felt close enough to touch, but there was a shadow side to it as well. From childhood, he also described disturbances of another kind, frightening presences, dark figures, nights of torment that he could not explain and did not have the words for. He was a boy who lived, it seemed, with the veil between worlds worn thin, and a thinness like that brings light through it, but it lets other things through, too. His health was fragile. It would remain fragile his entire life. He suffered fevers, chest illnesses, a frailty that doctors could never quite name. More than once, those around him feared he would not survive to adulthood. And yet the desire that grew in him was not a small one. He wanted to give his entire life to God. He wanted to become a friar. There was a problem. To enter religious life and study for the priesthood required an education his family could not afford. A poor farming family in southern Italy did not have money for tutors and books and seminary fees, so his father did something extraordinary. Francesco Forgione left his wife, his children, and the only home he had ever known, and he sailed across the ocean to America, to work as a laborer in a foreign country whose language he did not speak, so that he could send money home to pay for his son's education. He did it not once but twice. Years of his life spent in exile and hard labor, so that his boy could answer the call he believed had come from God. It is worth pausing on that. Before Padre Pio was anything the world would later marvel at, he was the son of a man who crossed an ocean for him. The future saint was built, in part, on the hidden sacrifice of an unremarkable father who would never be famous, who simply loved his son enough to disappear into years of loneliness so that the boy could become what he was meant to be. At 15 years old, Francesco Forgione entered the Capuchin friars, a branch of the Franciscan order known for its severity, its poverty, its long hours of prayer and penance. He put on the brown habit. He took a new name. From that day, he was Friar Pio. He was ordained a priest in 1910 at the age of 23, a frail young man with dark eyes and a quiet manner, who no one outside his small circle had any reason to notice. But heaven had already begun to notice him, and what was coming would make it impossible for the world to keep ignoring the monk from Pietrelcina. In the years after his ordination, something began to happen to Padre Pio he kept hidden for as long as he could. He began to feel the wounds before he ever bore them. In his letters to his spiritual directors, letters he never intended for the world to read, he wrote, with a kind of embarrassed reluctance, of sharp pains in his hands and feet and side. Pain in the exact places where Christ had been pierced. There were no marks, nothing anyone could see, but the suffering was real, and it came and went, and he did not understand it, and more than anything, he was afraid of it being noticed. He prayed, and this is one of the most telling things about him, not to be spared the suffering, but to be spared the attention. He asked God to let him carry the pain in secret, to take away the visible signs, if there were ever to be any, so that no one would look at him. For a time, his prayer was answered. The pain remained invisible, and then came the morning of the 20th of September, 1918. He was at the friary of San Giovanni Rotondo, a remote, wind-swept place on the Gargano Peninsula, a mountain town far from anywhere important. It was a Friday. The other friars were occupied with their duties. Padre Pio had gone, alone, into the choir loft, above the small church to make his thanksgiving after Mass. Before him hung a large wooden crucifix. What happened in that loft, he would only ever describe in fragments, and always with reluctance. He spoke of a figure, of rays of light, of something that pierced him through, hands, feet, and side, leaving him on the floor in a state between agony and ecstasy, unsure how long he had lain there. When he was able to rise, the marks were on his body. The 5 wounds of the crucifixion, open and bleeding, in his hands, in his feet, in his side. He tried, even then, to hide them. He wrapped his hands. He kept them tucked into the sleeves of his habit. He avoided being seen. But wounds that bleed cannot be hidden forever, and word began to spread, first among the friars, then through the town, then, like a current that could not be stopped, out into the wider world. Padre Pio was the first priest in the recorded history of the Church to bear the visible stigmata, and from the moment the world learned of it, The scrutiny began. The church did not celebrate. The church grew cautious. Such claims had been made before and proven false, and the authorities were not about to be embarrassed by a young friar in mountain village. So they sent doctors. Not chaplains, doctors. Physicians of reputation, men trained to detect deception, instructed to examine the wounds with cold, clinical eyes. They came, they studied. One described wounds that passed cleanly through the hand. Another searched for signs of self-infliction, of chemical irritants, of fraud of any kind, and reported that he could find none. The wounds did not behave the way wounds behave. They did not become infected. They did not heal. They did not respond to the treatments doctors tried. They simply remained, for years, and then for decades, bleeding, the same, while the man who bore them grew old around them. And there was something else the people who came near him noticed. Scent. A sweetness in the air around him and around his wounds, described variously as roses, as violets, as something no one could quite place. It would come and go, without explanation. People spoke of catching it suddenly, even at a distance, even when he was nowhere near. The faithful called it the odor of sanctity. The skeptics had no name for it at all. For the rest of his life, Padre Pio carried those 5 wounds. 50 years, every day, saying Mass with bleeding hands, walking on bleeding feet, living, hour by hour, inside the pain of a death that was not his own. He never spoke of it as a privilege. He spoke of it, when he spoke of it at all, as a weight. A cross laid on him that he had not asked for and could not put down. He had prayed to carry it in secret. Heaven, instead, had made him impossible to hide. If the stigmata made Padre Pio famous, it was the confessional that made him unforgettable. He spent the heart of his life in a small wooden box, hearing the sins of strangers, hour after hour, day after day. By the height of his ministry, he was hearing confessions for 10, 12, sometimes 15 hours a day, beginning before dawn, continuing long after the rest of the friary had gone to rest. People traveled 4 days to reach him. They slept in the streets of San Giovanni Rotondo. They took numbers and waited, sometimes for a week or more, just for the chance to kneel before him for a few minutes. And the stories that came out of that confessional are, in their own way, stranger than the wounds, because Padre Pio, it was said again and again, already knew. People described kneeling down to confess, opening their mouths to speak, and being stopped. He would tell them the sin they had come to confess before they had said a word. He would name the year, the place, the person. He would reach past the careful, edited version they had prepared and put his finger directly on the thing they had buried, the sin they had been carrying for 20 years, the one they had never told anyone, the one they had half decided not to mention even now. There was a man who came having been away from the church for decades, who had prepared a short and convenient list. Padre Pio looked at him and recited, calmly, the sins he had left off the list. There were people who came to test him, to catch him out, and who walked away pale and silent, having been seen straight through, and he was not gentle with everyone. This is part of what made him real, rather than a comfortable legend. To the humble, to the broken, to the genuinely sorrowful, he could be tender beyond words, a father weeping with the child who had come home. But to those who came without true repentance, who knelt down still clinging to the sin, still excusing it, still unwilling to let it go, he could be severe. He turned people away. He shut the little window of the confessional in their faces. He told them, in effect, come back when you mean it. It sounds harsh, but the people he turned away rarely stayed away. Many of them, faced for the first time with someone who would not let them lie to themselves, went home and broke open, and came back weeks or months later as different people. He was not cruel to them. He was unwilling to participate in their self-deception. There is a difference, and they felt it. What was happening in that confessional, the church has never claimed to fully explain it. The people who experienced it did not need an explanation. They came carrying things too heavy to say out loud, and they met a man who already knew, and who did not flinch, and who pointed them toward mercy anyway. Whatever the mechanism, the effect was the same. People left that wooden box feeling that they had been completely known and not condemned, but loved. That, perhaps, is the deepest thing about Padre Pio's confessional. It was not a magic trick. It was not a performance. It was the experience, given to ordinary people in a small Italian town, of being seen all the way down. Every hidden thing, every buried failure, every secret they had never spoken, and discovering, on the far side of being seen, not rejection, but forgiveness. It is what every human being is most afraid of and most longs for at the same time, to be fully known and still wanted. For half a century, in a box of wood on a mountain in Italy, people lined up by the thousands to taste it. And then there are the stories that are hardest of all to repeat with a straight face, and which the witnesses repeated with complete conviction for the rest of their lives. They say Padre Pio could be in two places at once. The accounts are numerous, and they follow a pattern. Someone, far away from San Giovanni Rotondo, in another city, sometimes in another country, would describe a visit. A friar with the scent of roses about him, appearing at the bedside of someone who was dying, a voice heard in a moment of despair, a presence in a room, comforting, instructing, sometimes warning, and then gone. And later, when these people made their way to the friary to find the monk who had come to them, they would recognize him instantly. It was him, the same face, the same voice, the same scent. And yet, at the very hour they described, Padre Pio had been at San Giovanni Rotondo, praying, hearing confessions, saying Mass. He had not left. Witnesses at the friary could swear to it. He had been into places at the same time. He never bragged about it. When people pressed him, he deflected or gave answers that explained nothing. Once, when asked directly how such a thing could happen, he is said to have given an answer that was barely an answer at all. Something about it being simply an extension of God's will, a thing he did not control and did not fully understand himself. He treated it the way he treated all of it, not as a power he possessed, but as something done through him, often without his choosing. The most famous story of all comes from the Second World War. San Giovanni Rotondo sat in a region of strategic importance, and during the war, Allied bombers were sent on missions over the area. The story that has been told for generations, passed down, retold, impossible now to fully verify, is that pilots flying toward the town to release their payload reported seeing a figure in the sky, a friar, a man in a brown habit with his arms raised, standing in the clouds above the town, and that, faced with this, they found they could not release their bombs. The bomb doors would not open. The aircraft turned away. The town was spared. When some of those airmen later came to San Giovanni Rotondo, the story goes, they saw Padre Pio and recognized the friar from the sky. Is it true? It is a story. It carries all the marks of a story that grows in the retelling, and an honest account has to say so. The Church does not require anyone to believe it, but it is told and retold because it captures something the people who knew him believed to the depths of their souls, that this man stood somehow at the meeting place of heaven and earth, that the ordinary rules of distance and presence did not bind him the way they bind the rest of us, that when he prayed, things happened far away beyond any line he could have reached with his own two wounded hands. We live inside walls, inside the limits of one body, in one place, at one time. The accounts of Padre Pio's bilocation unsettle us precisely because they suggest those limits are not as absolute as we assume. That love, in someone given over completely to God, might travel further than a body can walk. You do not have to believe a word of it, but the witnesses did, and they were not, by and large, fools. They were doctors and farmers and soldiers and grieving mothers, ordinary people, who carried these experiences to their graves and never recanted them. It would be a comfortable thing to imagine that a man so close to heaven lived a life of peace. He did not. Padre Pio's life was, by his own testimony and the testimony of those who lived alongside him, a battle, and not only a spiritual battle in some abstract, interior sense. He spoke, again, in letters never meant to be public, of attacks, physical attacks. He described being struck, thrown, beaten in the night by presences he had no doubt were demonic. He wrote of his cell being left in disorder, of being hurled to the floor, of waking from such encounters with real marks on his body. His brother friars did not dismiss this as the imagining of a frail and feverish man. They reported hearing it, crashes in the night from his cell, sounds of struggle, of furniture moving, of blows. They would find him afterward bruised and depleted, having spent the dark hours in a war the rest of them could only hear through the wall. For a man who lived with the veil worn thin since childhood, it seems the same thinness that led heaven so close also exposed him, all his life, to the assaults of whatever stands against heaven. The light came through, so did the storm. But there was another battle. Padre Pio fought, quieter, longer, and in some ways more painful than any night of blows. It was the battle of being doubted by his own church. As his fame grew, so did the suspicion of the authorities in Rome. Reports were filed, investigations were opened. There were those in positions of power who were convinced he was a fraud, or unstable, or at the very least a dangerous source of disorder and superstition. And so, for long stretches of the 1920s and 1930s, restrictions were placed on him. At times he was forbidden to celebrate Mass in public. At times he was forbidden to hear confessions, the very thing thousands traveled across the world to receive from him. He was cut off, silenced, set aside. And here is the thing that tells you who he really was. He obeyed. He did not protest. He did not rally his enormous following against the church that was restricting him. And his following was enormous. He could have caused a great deal of trouble if he had wished to. He did not write angry letters or seek to clear his name in the eyes of the world. He simply submitted. He said Mass alone, in private, when that was all he was allowed. He waited. He suffered the humiliation in silence, treating obedience to the church as a higher thing than his own vindication. This, more than the stigmata, more than the bilocation, is the detail that the people who study his life keep returning to. Anyone can claim wounds. Anyone can have stories told about them. But a man who is being unjustly silenced by the very institution he has given his life to, who has the power to fight back, and chooses instead to obey in humble silence, that is a thing that cannot be faked. That is character. That is the slow, unspectacular holiness that no special effect can imitate. The restrictions were eventually lifted. The doubts, in time, gave way. But Padre Pio never seemed to hold the years of suspicion against anyone. He had been treated as a problem to be managed by the church he loved, and he had loved it anyway, exactly as the figure on the crucifix he prayed before had loved the world that condemned him. For all the wounds and the wonders, Padre Pio did not see his vocation as being a marvel for people to gawk at. He saw it as a life poured out for the suffering. And out of that conviction came the most concrete, visible work of his entire life. He built a hospital. San Giovanni Rotondo was a poor and isolated town. Medical care for the people of that region was scarce and far away. And Padre Pio, who lived every day inside physical pain, who heard in the confessional the endless catalog of human sorrow, conceived of something ambitious almost to the point of impossibility. A great hospital on that remote mountain where the sick would be cared for, not as cases but as people. He called it the Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza, the home for the relief of suffering. It was a strange dream for a friar with no money, in a place with no infrastructure. But the donations came from the faithful who loved him, from the people whose lives he had touched, from strangers moved by the idea. The funds gathered, slowly, then steadily, and the building rose. In 1956, it opened its doors. Today it stands as one of the most respected hospitals in the region, treating hundreds of thousands of patients, exactly as he had imagined it. His vision for it was unusual, and it tells you how his mind worked. He did not see medicine and prayer as rivals or as separate spheres. He wanted a place where the finest medical science his age could offer would sit side by side with prayer, where the body would be treated by skilled hands and the soul tended at the same time. He believed the sick deserved both. He refused to choose between them, and around the hospital, and far beyond it, he built something else. Prayer groups, networks of ordinary people, scattered across Italy, and then across the world, who committed themselves to praying together. He understood something simple and profound, that the work of heaven is not done only by stigmatics and mystics in remote friaries, but by ordinary believers in their own homes and parishes, lifting up the suffering of the world in prayer. He multiplied himself, in a sense, not through wonders, but through teaching countless ordinary people to pray. This was the texture of his days, for decade after decade, rising in the small hours, saying Mass with wounded hands, a Mass that could last far longer than any other priest's because he entered so deeply into it. Long hours in the confessional, the care of the hospital and the prayer groups, the constant, grinding pain, the endless stream of people who needed something from him, and always, threaded through it, the prayer, the night hours given to God, the rosary, worn smooth in his fingers. He once described the rosary, the simple repeated prayers of ordinary Catholics, as his weapon, not the stigmata, not bilocation, a string of beads prayed faithfully, day after ordinary day. There is a lesson hidden in that, easy to miss among all the wonders. The most extraordinary man of his age located his real power not in the extraordinary, but in the ordinary, faithfully repeated. The hidden Mass, the daily rosary, the unglamorous care of the sick, the long obedience. The wounds drew the crowds, but the work was done in the things no one would have filmed. By the 1960s, Padre Pio was an old man. The body that had been frail since childhood, that had borne 5 open wounds for half a century, that had been struck in the night and worn down by endless days of service, was failing. He grew weaker. He could no longer manage the long hours. The man who had said Mass with bleeding hands for 50 years now needed help to stand. And then, in his final months, something happened that those around him could hardly believe. The wounds began to close. The stigmata, the 5 marks that had bled, unhealed, unexplained, for 50 years, that no medicine had been able to touch, that doctors had examined and re-examined in vain, began, near the end, to fade. And by the time he died, they were gone. The skin, where the wounds had been for half a century, was reported to be clean, unbroken, as though they had never been there at all. He died on the 23rd of September, 1968, at the age of 81. The wounds that heaven had opened on a September morning in 1918 had closed by a September day 50 years later. As if, the work being finished, they were simply withdrawn. The funeral was overwhelming. More than 100,000 people came to San Giovanni Rotondo to bury the poor farmer's son from Pietrelcina. The remote mountain town that no one had heard of when he arrived had become a place of pilgrimage, and it has remained one ever since. Today, the shrine that holds his body is among the most visited religious sites in the world. Millions come every year to pray where he prayed, to kneel where the thousands once lined up for confession. And the church that had once doubted him, that had silenced him, that had treated him for years as a problem to be contained, that same church, in time, recognized what the people had known all along. In 2002, he was declared a saint. The man who did it was Pope John Paul II, who, as a young Polish priest decades earlier, long before anyone imagined he would one day lead the church, had himself traveled to San Giovanni Rotondo to meet the friar with the wounded hands. The young priest, who had once knelt before Padre Pio, rose, in the fullness of time, to stand before the world and name him Saint Pio of Pietrelcina. It is a long road from a boy slipping away to pray a poor village church to a saint venerated by millions. And the strangest thing about that road is how ordinary most of it was. A frail child, a father in exile across an ocean, a young friar no one noticed, a lifetime in one small place, doing the same things over and over: the Mass, the confessions, the rosary, the care of the sick, through doubt, through pain, through being misunderstood. The wonders are what we remember: the wounds, the scent of roses, the figure in two places at once. But the saint was made in the unremarkable hours, in the obedience, in the refusal to defend himself, in the willingness to be fully known by every stranger who knelt before him, and to point each one of them, gently or sternly, toward mercy. What remained, when the wounds had closed and the body was laid to rest, was not the spectacle. What remained was the love. The Church does not require you to believe the wonders. It does not ask you to accept the stories of bilocation, or the figure in the sky, or any single miracle attributed to him. These things are not articles of faith. You are free to weigh them, to doubt them, to set them aside. But two things are beyond dispute, and they may be the only two that matter. The first is that he suffered, really, physically, for 50 years, in a way that medicine could not explain and could not relieve. Whatever else is true, that is true. And the second is what he did with it. He did not waste his suffering. He did not let it turn him bitter, or proud, or self-pitying. He took the pain that was laid on him without his asking, and he turned it outward, into thousands of hours of mercy in a confessional, into a hospital for the sick, into a lifetime of prayer for people he would never meet. He let the wound make him more tender, not less. He became, through 50 years of pain, a place where broken people could come and be fully seen and fully loved. That is a part of his story that is not about him at all. It is about you, because you are carrying something too. Maybe not 5 visible wounds, but a wound, something that hurts, that you did not choose, that you cannot fully explain, that you keep hidden from almost everyone. Something you are afraid to bring into the light, because you are afraid that if you were truly seen, all the way down, you would not be loved. Padre Pio's whole life is the answer to that fear. There is a place where you can be completely known, every hidden thing, and not condemned. He spent 50 years pointing people toward it. He bled, for half a century, as a living sign of it. And whatever you make of the wonders, that sign still stands. If you are carrying a wound right now, one you cannot show anyone, let this story speak to you. The man who bore the wounds of Christ did not arrive at peace by escaping his suffering. He arrived there by carrying it all the way, with his hands open and his heart intact. This video was made with gratitude and reverence. To every soul carrying a hidden wound, this is for you. Thanks be to God. Glory to Him forever and ever. If something in this story touched you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And if you want to keep walking deeper into the lives of the saints, the mystics, and the hidden face of God, subscribe to Vinodol Faith. We will keep looking.